Okay, we're now going to get started with the second presentation of this morning. Bryan Schaaf oversees the Refugee Health Portfolio of the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. In this capacity, he is responsible for developing and coordinating the Bureau's health policies and programs with other governmental, non-governmental, and international partners. In addition to refugee health, he works on issues relating to civil-military coordination and emergency response. Prior to his current position, he worked at the Office of Global Health Affairs at the Department of Health and Human Services. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Haiti from 2000 to 2002. It is my pleasure to now welcome up to the podium Bryan Schaaf.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me here today. I actually grew up not so far away from here in Green Bay, Wisconsin. Eventually, though, I migrated to Washington, D.C. I've been there for about 8 years now, and the majority of that time, I've been responsible for health issues at the State Department Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. That's essentially the humanitarian wing of the State Department. And if you're asking, why does the State Department have a humanitarian wing? Well, on one hand, we were created by Congress long ago to address refugee issues. And today the Bureau works with many other populations as well. But refugees are a regional issue. They're starting in one country and they're going to another. But more than that, humanitarian problems don't have humanitarian solutions. They have political solutions. And so the State Department is well placed to make humanitarian assistance possible, but at the same time, working towards solutions to these humanitarian emergencies. What I'd like to do, there we go. What I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about humanitarian assistance in general, go over PRM's role in supporting humanitarian assistance, note some linkages, some often overlooked linkages, between the environment and humanitarian assistance, and then as a case study, talk with you a little bit about the U.S. government's response to the Libya conflict, which is ongoing today. And I'd like to make this as interactive as possible, so stop me at any time, please, with comments and with questions. And I have some questions for you as well. The first of which is, what is humanitarian assistance? So let's work on our own definition of humanitarian assistance right now. What are some different components of humanitarian assistance? Yes? Okay, I hear shelter, emergency shelter. Okay. Food, water, and other basic needs. Okay, health care. Safety, exactly. That's a good one too. Protection, protecting the rights of people who are been affected by emergencies as well. So now we're thinking about women and children in particular. So what I'm hearing is assistance, including providing the basic needs, and then protecting populations as well. So who needs humanitarian assistance? What are some situations where people may require humanitarian assistance? Okay, I hear war and other conflicts, natural disasters. Yesterday we spent time talking about refugees and asylum seekers, so people who are crossing borders. But what if I don't cross a border? What if, for example, I'm a Haitian who's affected by the earthquake and I've lost my home and I'm still within my country? Or what about if I am in Darfur and I'm fleeing for the safety of myself and my family, but I haven't crossed a border? Are these populations who require protection and assistance as well? Well, they would be internally displaced. They'd be internally displaced, still requiring protection and assistance. And in fact, it's often much more difficult to protect and assist internally displaced persons. If you were going to guess if there were more refugees or internally displaced persons in the world, what would you guess? Okay, I hear IDPs. And you'd be absolutely right. In the Cold War era, we saw when we had two parties to a conflict, we saw more refugees. But now in the world that we're living in today, where there may be 30, 40, or more parties to conflicts with shifting allegiances, we see many more internally displaced persons. So who makes humanitarian assistance possible? Okay, United Nations organizations? NGOs? Yes, absolutely. Everybody in this room who pays taxes is supporting humanitarian assistance. The United States government, with your tax money, is the largest supporter of any humanitarian organization that you care to name. And they're able to provide that support to these organizations through your tax money. But at the same time, Americans are very generous as well about supporting these international organizations and these non-governmental organizations directly. So everybody in this room is involved in supporting humanitarian assistance. But let me give you some examples, though. How do you determine who receives humanitarian assistance? Well, ideally, how would we determine who receives humanitarian assistance? It often works that way, you're right, but ideally, how do we determine who receives humanitarian assistance? Okay, so we ideally determine who receives humanitarian assistance based on need. So let's say there's a flood in Haiti, and I want to do something about that. So I send televisions to Haiti because I'm concerned that they can't watch television anymore. Is that humanitarian assistance? Okay, so that's not humanitarian assistance. What if in another country there's a disaster and organizations start dropping food from helicopters and distributing it from the back of the trucks, which means that young men are the ones receiving this food because women and children and the disabled are not able to get to it because of the way that's distributed. Is that humanitarian assistance?
The assistance is humanitarian, the distribution.
The intentions are humanitarian, maybe humanitarian there, but the way in which it was distributed prevented it from having an impact. And there are so many different sectors in humanitarian assistance that we talked about: food, water, sanitation, protection, and so on. There's many different parts of it, but there are certain principles that apply throughout all those sectors, and one of which is reaching the most vulnerable, the ones who need it most. So we talked a little bit about refugees, asylum seekers. We have internally displaced persons. Could be displaced by natural disaster, could be displaced by conflict. Vulnerable migrants. Okay, we talked a bit about the environment and and the role that environment plays in migration. Another vulnerable migrant group would be, people who have been trafficked. Another population that might need humanitarian assistance includes stateless populations. Have you ever heard this phrase before? People who are stateless? This is the first time we've heard that phrase, stateless? Okay, so a stateless person is somebody who's not recognized as a citizen of any country. And because of that, they're not entitled to, their basic rights are not honored by the government in the country where they are. So just as an example, if your parents are Haitians living in the Dominican Republic, and you're born in the Dominican Republic, even though you've never been to Haiti, the Dominican government will regard you as Haitian. So you may not receive birth registration or other documents while you're in the Dominican Republic, which puts you in limbo between a country you've never been to and the country you're living in now. So those are just some examples of populations that require humanitarian assistance. So this is the United States government's definition of humanitarian assistance, which is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and minimize the economic costs of conflicts, disasters, and displacement, which you've all hit on. So humanitarian assistance should be provided on the basis of need, according to principles of universality, impartiality, and human dignity, which is a fancy way of saying humanitarian assistance should be provided to those who need it, when needed, wherever they are. So because providing humanitarian assistance in Somalia is very difficult, that's not going to stop us. Or if a disaster happens in Iran, a country with a strained relationship and history with the United States. That's not going to stop us from trying to assist if we can. So if we look at, I keep hitting that button. These are the latest figures on displacement that are available to us. So if we look at the number of people who've been forcibly displaced, it's the highest figure in 15 years. If you include Palestinian refugees, the figure is 15.4 million. The number of internally displaced persons is 27.5 million. So you're right, the number of IDPs in the world is much higher than the number of refugees. Largest number of refugees? Refugees are usually in a country neighboring their home country. Pakistan, Iran, and Syria are the three countries hosting the largest number of refugees. And there are 7.2 million refugees in what we call protracted situations. So if you're a refugee, if you fled your home and you've gone to another country, on average, you're going to be outside of your home country for about 13 years. That's on average. And there's three solutions. You can go back safely and voluntarily to the country that you came from, but if you're a Darfuri refugee who's in Chad, that's not an option. You can't go back safely right now. You can be integrated where you're at. For example, your kids can be provided some education. You can have assistance in finding livelihoods, a job so you can support your family, or you can be resettled to another country. Or as some of my colleagues who work on that issue would say, if you can't protect refugees where they are, you bring them to where you can protect them. The blue represents refugees. The green represents asylum seekers. Green are returnees. What they mean by that are people who are going back to their home countries. Stateless persons who we talked about.
So the term stateless persons, I also got the impression that it would be like the Kurds, although they are recognized as
They are, the Kurds are in a number of different countries, and I can't speak to all the countries where they are, but if the country where a Kurd was did not recognize them as a citizen, and so refused to provide them with certification of their birth, refused to acknowledge them as citizens, denied them access to health care, education, based on their Kurdish descent, then certainly that would be a case where a Kurdish person was stateless. But, different countries would treat the Kurds differently, so Kurds may be regarded as citizens in one country, but not necessarily another, depending on the situation. Yes?
Saying that Latin America has many stateless persons and a small proportion of refugees that does Pakistan.
I know that's a little hard to see, but there are a very large number of internally displaced persons in Colombia, one of the largest populations in the world. There are refugees throughout Central and South America, but not to the extent that we see in Africa and South Asia, for example. In Colombia, we're mainly talking about an internally displaced person situation, but it's a very large one. All right, so providing humanitarian assistance has never been easy, but it is becoming more difficult. What do you think some of the challenges are in providing humanitarian assistance?
If it's a natural disaster, there's always the availability to get to the area. And also if it's shipment and things like that. If it's airplanes can only take a limited amount of equipment, and ships can take more, but they take a longer time to get there. So it's, I think, just transportation.
Okay, so logistics can be a challenge for certain, and the two major disasters in 2010 were the Pakistan floods and the Haiti earthquake. In the case of the Haiti earthquake, the airport became non-functional, the port was destroyed, there wasn't a secondary airport that could handle large cargo planes, and so getting both people and goods, because Haiti itself produces very little, getting people and humanitarian cargo into the country was very difficult. So logistics can also be complicated by insecurity as well, not just getting things in, but getting people and cargo to where it's going safely. What are some other challenges? Yes?
We have sort of a basic supply and demand problem as well, limited
No, that's true. I mean, that's true. When funding is scarce, I mean, prioritizing, according to need, ideally, can be very difficult. Yes?
Governments not cooperating with humanitarian assistance to certain populations within their own countries.
That could be a really challenge. That could be a real challenge, particularly with internally displaced persons, when it's their own government that's displacing them. It can be very sensitive. Yes?
Coordinating all the groups, because it seems like in Haiti, there were a lot of people trying to give assistance, and they all have their own agendas, their own rules, and coordinating all those.
I have a colleague who says that on most death certificates from emergencies, cause of death could be listed as lack of coordination. And there's something to that. Okay, we've hit on a number of challenges. Here are some of the emerging challenges we're struggling with as well. We talked about how there's increasing displacement in the world, particularly as a result of natural disasters. There was an increase from 150 million in 1990 to 300 million in 2008. So many of these disasters are related to water, too much of it or too little of it. In 2010, we also saw the earthquake in Haiti. So the severity of these disasters are also linked to urbanization. Coco mentioned that the majority of the world's population is urban. And also, increasingly, so are refugee populations. But in the case of an earthquake, earthquakes don't kill people, shelter does. In the case of Port-au-Prince, you had extremely high population density, extremely low quality housing, which resulted in widespread death and damage. Also, there's what we call the relief to development gap. This is just a way of saying that the international community is much better at humanitarian assistance than it is at long-term development. Humanitarian assistance is like the life support. And we're pretty good at that. We're pretty good at getting food, water, other basic necessities to emergency-affected populations. Less good at getting a government to a point where it doesn't need that anymore. And that involves, part of it is that recovery involves really hard decisions. If you look at the case of the Pakistan flooding, floods of that magnitude are not unprecedented in Pakistan. What is unprecedented was the number of people living in vulnerable areas within Pakistan, areas that were prone to flooding, but were also fertile, so a good place to be a farmer. So the humanitarian response took place, but hard decisions were not made as to whether people should or should not return to those areas. And if they shouldn't return, well, where else should they go? And by default, people are going back to those areas and will be vulnerable to floods in the future. We talked about insecurity, lack of access to populations. Another challenge is something we call mixed migration flows, which is just a way of saying that increasingly we're seeing refugees and migrants traveling along the same corridors. So you may have refugees together with economic migrants, smuggled persons, trafficked persons, unaccompanied minors, which is just a way to say children without their parents, who are particularly vulnerable. And then environmental degradation, which Coco covered very well. It's even if climate change were not part of the picture, the environmental degradation that's being caused is severe and is having humanitarian consequences. And I wish I wouldn't hit that button. Okay, so in terms of PRM roles and responsibilities, I think we can condense this down into 3 distinct responsibilities. One of them is, on behalf of the American taxpayer, we provide funding to 4 international organizations that are instrumental in protecting and assisting refugee populations. The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, a very good organization that protects and assists Palestinian refugees called UNRWA, and an organization that specializes in working with vulnerable migrants called the International Organization for Migration. Have you heard of those agencies before? Is this the first time you're hearing about them? Yeah? Okay, well, we could talk a little more about them. We also engage other governments to ensure that they, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, depending, to encourage them to protect and assist vulnerable populations, to respect their rights, And then we resettle a certain number of refugees to the United States every year. In fact, more than all the other countries of the world combined. Did anybody here know that the United States resettled refugees? Yeah? So I'm seeing a few people are familiar with that. Okay, that's great. So if we're talking about who's responsible for refugee health, yes, sir?
Sorry, can I ask, how many is that? How many are resettled per year?
It depends on the year. After 9/11, the program shrunk in size, but it's increased. It's been increasing again over the past few years. Approximately 75,000 per year. And so these are people for whom no other solution was available. So to protect them, we brought them to the United States. It's really a public-private partnership with the American government, with community groups, state governments. So if we're talking about who's responsible for refugee health, well, the host government should be responsible for the health of refugees. In reality, though, because of a lack of funding or a lack of political will, sometimes both, the host government often plays a fairly minimal role in promoting the health of refugee populations. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or UNHCR, has a global mandate to protect and assist refugee populations, and that includes health. The one exception there, though, is Palestinian refugees, because UNRWA is responsible for their health in Gaza, West Bank, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. So that's not to say that you won't see other international organizations or non-governmental organizations involved in promoting refugee health. You might see the World Health Organization, assisting UNHCR, especially if it's an urban population. You would probably see that. You might see the United Nations Children's Fund, who's very good at water and sanitation programming, lending a hand to UNHCR, especially if it's an emergency situation and the population's very large. You might see the International Committee of the Red Cross, who is very good at operating in insecure areas, and they also have a world-class prosthetics program for people who've lost limbs. NGOs, really, the NGOs are the ones who are out there doing the heavy lifting. You might see NGOs like the International Rescue Committee, the International Medical Corps, Save the Children, CARE, and so on. And you might see local groups. So in order to make these services possible, financial support from governments is essential. And PRM is the lead for refugee populations. And I did it again. So in terms of who's responsible for the health of internally displaced persons, the host government should be responsible. These are their own citizens. However, as we've talked about, this is often a more sensitive issue than refugee populations. The UN system recognized that they were not doing as good a job as they should protecting and assisting internally displaced persons. So they put in place a new approach called the cluster approach. I think the sectoral approach would have made more sense, but that's what it is. It's a cluster approach. And basically, it designated a UN agency responsible for a particular sector in the event of a major IDP emergency. So if you were to go to Haiti, if you were to go to Pakistan, if you were to go to if you're going to go to Sudan or another country where the cluster approach is in place, you see that the World Health Organization is responsible for bringing together all the different health actors. That includes the Ministry of Health, that includes local groups, international groups. World Food Program is the same thing with food. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund for nutrition, water, sanitation, hygiene issues. The environment is addressed in the cluster approach by an organization called the United Nations Environmental Program, but it's considered a cross-cutting issue because it affects all the different sectors involved in humanitarian assistance. So UNEP, which is fairly small, has the responsibility for making sure that people are including the environment in all the different sectors. And there's a unit within USAID called the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and they're the government's lead on IDPs. I know that's a lot. Any questions about that? About IDPs, the cluster approach? Yes?
Just within UN organizations, how much coordination is there? Apparently among NGOs, one of the problems is there's a lot of redundancy. Who moves when something happens first? And which UN organization coordinates?
Well, if we're talking about internally displaced persons, the cluster approach, the problem before is there was no responsibility. There was no responsibility. This was put in place in 2006. And if a water program is not up to standards and people are getting sick and dying of waterborne diseases, who's really responsible? Oh, well, it's the UN system. What this did is it made somebody responsible for each of the sectors. So in terms of water, for example, UNICEF is responsible. In terms of food, the World Food Program is responsible. So someone is responsible for what's happening in that sector and for who's operating in that sector and whether it's being coordinated or not. But I should add, though, that coordination includes coordinating with people affected by the disaster or the emergency themselves. If you look at Haiti, the agencies were trying to coordinate with themselves, but because the meetings were largely in English, and they were often held in places that were very far to get to and inconvenient for people to get to, you probably wouldn't have seen a single Haitian in the first few weeks of the emergency. And that's a big coordination gap, because coordination is more than the responders. Does that make sense? Okay.
Do you see a lot of redundancy? I mean,
In certain situations, you do see some redundancy. For example, in the Haiti response, because Haiti was so close, you had more responders than probably could have been coordinated. And because they were not coordinating, they were often working at cross purposes and in the same areas as others. And so you do see redundancy in some emergencies.
is there any coordination between the UN organizations and NGOs?
Yes. In fact, if you were to go to these cluster meetings in any countries, Haiti or otherwise, you would see a great many NGOs sitting in the room. And it's the job of the UN agency to help them coordinate, to help them determine what the needs are, to budget, to determine who's going to work where, to communicate with donors, and so on. If we're talking about refugees, really it's the NGOs who are doing the heavy lifting. UNHCR, they're responsible for coordinating and they're responsible for monitoring how the programs are going, building partnerships. But it's the NGOs that are doing the heavy lifting. They're the ones actually providing services to the refugees. Oh, sorry. When people think about water programs, they often forget about sanitation. You can have a perfectly good water program, but if you ignore sanitation, people are still going to get sick. And on top of that, people especially forget hygiene, right? So people call that WASH for short, water, sanitation, hygiene. If you're interested in protecting the health of populations affected by disasters and emergencies, you have to think WASH. Yeah. Just some quick best practices in refugee health. We always make health services for refugees available to the host communities. So in other words, people living in the same areas as to where the refugees are. We always try to provide services to the refugees at the same level that's available in the country where the refugees are. We try to meet minimum standards. So what does that mean, minimum standards? So this is a handbook called the Sphere Handbook. And this was developed after years of debate and argument and ultimately consensus between the UN, NGOs, Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, and so on. So it sets out, if you're in an emergency or a disaster, and I'll give you some examples of this later, but how much water does a person need? How much food does a person need? What kind of shelter should they have? And what kind of shelter should they have? How much space in that shelter, and so on. I mean, if we didn't have this, imagine responding to disasters and emergencies and having to make it up again and again and again, sitting around a table with 50 people and arguing about how much water populations need. Well, we don't have to do that because it's laid out for us, what we're working towards. It's not always going to be possible to get to that minimum standard right away, but we're working towards it. And our programs, we always try to build the capacity of refugees themselves, so they can plan, so they can carry out, so they can monitor health programs themselves. And then we always try to take into account, like we discussed before, the age, the gender, and diversity in programming as well. So there are a number of environmental issues in protecting and assisting refugees and IDPs that often get overlooked. And the first one is land. If we're talking about refugees, refugee camps are often located on marginal land. I mean, there's a reason that people don't live there. If you look at this picture, this is a refugee camp in Kenya called Ifo. It's shaped like a bowl, like this. So it's obviously prone to flooding, but this is the land that the government allocated because nobody was there. If you do have a site where that's going to be prone to natural disasters, you've got to have good site planners on board who can determine how you minimize those risks, where the shelters are going to be, where the latrines are going to be, where the water points are going to be. Because what we see is there's often a short-term mentality towards planning refugee camps, where people are like, well, we'll just build something temporary, and hopefully very soon the refugees will go back. But in reality, the average is 13 years. But if you want additional land for your refugee camps, you've got to negotiate that with the government. So even if you have the land, the government may put restrictions on what you can do with that land. So in Kenya, for example, refugees are not allowed to farm. They're not allowed to produce their own food. So they're completely dependent on food from the international community. In Uganda, they are allowed to farm. So if you were to go to Kenya or you were to go to Uganda, where do you think the nutritional status of the kids is going to be better? Better in Uganda, for certain. And another issue that doesn't get talked about enough, it's a relief issue, it's a development issue, is lack of formal land tenure, which means people don't know who owns what land. So it's a source of conflict in a lot of different countries, and there's no one UN agency that's responsible for it. If you look at Haiti, for example, the humanitarian response, people were successful in providing food, water, and so on, but part of that transition to recovery would have involved getting people into transitional shelters. But how are you going to do that without land? There's no formal system in Haiti for knowing who owns what pieces of land, and the government doesn't have a policy for eminent domain, for taking land and reimbursing landowners for that land. So that was a major gap, and still is in Haiti in terms of, transitioning over to recovery. And imagine if you're a refugee and you've been outside your country for, let's say, 10 years, and you come back, and somebody's been living in your house for 7. How do you resolve that conflict? And in some cases, UNHCR can step in and help resolve those conflicts. But if there's not a national policy, it can be very difficult. So another environmental issue, of course, is water. So this is that water there is water that refugees in a refugee camp in East Sudan were drinking. Does anyone feel comfortable drinking that? No? I mean, it's an essential health issue because you need access to enough clean water to promote public health and to reduce pressure on your clinics. Because what you usually see in traditional refugee camps is that diarrhea is one of the leading causes of sickness and death. Does anybody want to guess what the other 3 are? So we said diarrhea. Well, cholera is a type of diarrhea. Malaria, we've got 2. You've all been vaccinated against it? Measles. Measles is the 3rd. And the last one? Anybody here had a child with pneumonia? Okay, it's a type of respiratory infection. And that's the other one, that's the last one that we usually see in these settings. But water programs often fall short, and there's a variety of reasons for that. Sometimes you don't have the right people in the right places. Surprise, surprise, well-qualified technical experts often don't want to work in refugee camps. Sometimes there's a lack of involving the community so that they can maintain the equipment themselves. Lack of maintenance, lack of monitoring to make sure that the water programs, the sanitation programs, and so on are working well. So let's say that you've been sent to look at a water program in this refugee camp in Kenya. And as you're walking along, this is what you see. What are some of the questions that you start to ask yourself about this situation? Well, it's women and kids. It's almost always the women and kids who are responsible for collecting water. And that could be a very good chunk of their day. How many gallons can you fit in the jerry can? I think the standard jerry can is about 15. I think you can get 15 gallons of water in a standard jerry can. Very heavy. Very heavy. You have to carry it on your head if you're a woman or a girl. If you don't have something else to carry it with.
How's it going to be allocated?
Okay, how's it?
More people in a household
Uh-huh.
get a certain amount, who decides?
Yeah, how's it being allocated? Obviously, there's a lot of demand for this water. And people have queued up for it. It's obviously not on right now, and they're waiting for it. They're waiting for it to turn on. So there's a lot of pressure on this water point. Is there pressure on all the water points, or just this one? So let's say then you continue your walk in this refugee camp, and then you see this picture. So they're off the grid, so to speak. They've left the camp, and they're looking for water, which may be related to the fact that the line is too long inside the camp. So are there any concerns that you have when people are looking for water outside of the camp?
How far do they have to go?
Okay, well, and why does that matter?
Safety along the way.
Yeah, for certain, their safety, particularly if it's women and kids who are collecting that water.
Are they usually compromising the water line that the water?
Okay, so maybe there are reasons why the water pipe is not working anymore, and that's why people are looking here. If you're working in the health sector, then you're going to worry too about the health of people who are collecting water out here. The water may be treated inside the camp, but outside the camp, you don't know. Women and children who are collecting water from this point may be at risk for waterborne diseases as a result. So related to water, another issue is sanitation. I said I'd give some examples of the sphere standards from that handbook I mentioned. So if it's an emergency, you're always working towards a maximum of 20 people for a latrine, and then working towards getting people an individual family latrine as soon as possible. And then for protection, you always have to have separate latrines for men and for women, and keep them as close to the residences as you can. But it's not always that easy. There are complicating factors. If you are in parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the soil is hard rock, because it's hard lava rock, and you're not going to be able to dig into that. What was another issue we saw in Haiti is that internally displaced persons settled on land that was settled on property that was owned by major landowners, and they did not want latrines dug on their property. And so that was a source of tension between the responders and the landowners. And then natural disasters as well. If you have to site your latrines just right, because if there is a flood, like we saw in that picture before, it can destroy your latrines and cause health hazards if they flood over. So you're on a walk in this refugee camp in Chad, and you see this latrine. Would you feel comfortable using that? Yeah, it looks pretty flimsy. It looks pretty flimsy. There's a lack of privacy as a result, and I certainly don't see one for women and one for men in that picture. Yes? Well, whether it's safe or not has more to do with where it's sited. Standard latrine, you're probably going to dig that down about at least 10 feet. But it has more to do with where it's sited. Is it too close to a water point, for example? Is it on a hill? You know, it's about siting. It's more about siting it in the right place. So here's a picture from a camp for migrants. It was a transit camp. So what happened is you had migrants coming in for a few days at a time. You know, at any given time, you probably had about 10,000 people in this camp. And this is what I went and checked out the porta potties, and the reason why first of all, I was surprised to see the porta potties with as large a population as there was, but just to give you some context, people were using the field. They were defecating in the fields all around this camp. And so I went to take a look at the porta potties, and this is what I saw. But people knew what the porta potties were for. So you can see that people came, and then they decided to use the area outside of the porta potties because it was so disgusting. Do you think porta potties were the most appropriate response here?
Well, and put in their water bottles all around, so it's a toilet with words, if you've got a way to kind of flush it out.
Mm-hmm.
At least in Western standards, that's our system. We have fresh water and that flushes, but in this case, if they're out of water, and you just get buildup, and it's also like a diarrhea kind of situation.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that spreads disease, and there's also a lot of dirt around the site, so I don't know if they've actually stood on the toilet, which is very typical in a lot of places in the world,
Mhm.
particularly Western Africa.
Okay, you're absolutely right. So what I hear you saying is that many of the people who come through, well, have never seen this kind of toilet before. Even if they had, this was inappropriate technology for the situation. I mean, even in the worst emergency, at a minimum, you can dig trenches, you can establish a defecation field, men, women, make sure there's adequate privacy until you can get some proper latrines up that people are used to using, and enough of them. So I know I have to speed this up just a little bit now. So just very quickly on fuel, because this is another important environmental issue, and something which is, a good point to be incorporated in your classes with your students, is that nearly half of the world's population, about 3 billion people, cooks their food with inefficient stoves, primarily wood fuels. So you can ask your students how they prepare food at home to get started on this conversation. But this is a problem for refugee health because people often cook indoors. And if you have your child indoors with you while you're cooking, that's going to make the child more prone to respiratory infections. It's a protection concern because women have to travel to get the wood. The burden falls on them again to collect the wood fuels. So as they're traveling to collect the wood, that puts them at risk. For the environment, because of environmental degradation, all you have to do is look at a country like Haiti and see that the effect that deforestation has had on their vulnerability to natural disasters. And then it's also important for the relationship between the refugees and the host communities, because if refugees are going into land that's owned by the host community and they're collecting wood there, it's going to create tensions, and there's going to be conflict as a result of that. We're still very early in this, but there is some good work being done to determine what fuel-efficient stoves work best where. Some stoves are being used with alternative fuels like ethanol, still very small, but it's being done. Some organizations are working with solar power on clinics, on schools, and so on in refugee settings, which are often very, very sunny. There's been very little success to date with individual solar cookers. The evidence base is low, there's not this track record of success, but solar panels for facilities works very well in the refugee settings. And then reforestation. Refugees are like anybody else, they want to work. And you can tap their, that labor power to give them a job, to rehabilitate the environment at the same time. Oh, that was the Portuguese utility company. They have a foundation. And in Kenya, they've been putting solar panels on the clinics and on the schools and other communal facilities. So they don't have to pay for energy when they already have a readily available source of energy. So I know I have to move forward a little bit, but just to say that this is a picture of women gathering wood. And if you saw this, if you were in the field, you'd be starting to think about all the protection concerns related with them having to go further and further out as wood becomes less available. As far as wood fuels go, one of Secretary Clinton's priorities has been to address this issue through something called the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. It's an alliance between governments, the private sector, NGOs, and so on, to make these fuel-efficient stoves more available, affordable, accessible to women and their families throughout the world. But we're still, like I said, there's still a lot of work that has to be done, costing out what works best where, replicating it, improving the evidence base, and then building partnerships with universities, foundations in the private sector. Jamie, I think we're running out of time, right? Okay, yes?
I was just curious if you've ever witnessed a situation where you provide an alternative stove, but then because of the cultural, perception of cooking, they'll say, oh, I'd rather cook with wood anyway, it tastes better. The man would say that maybe, and then the women would be forced to go out anyway, and how you would deal with that.
It depends on the setting. It depends on the setting. In the case of Ethiopia, for example, where these ethanol stoves have worked so well, women were they were either going out to collect this wood or they were buying the wood. And so, there's a little bit of hesitancy at first, but once they saw that they could cook food and it tasted the same way, then there was acceptance for it. What I have seen is that sometimes, very, very nice stoves have been distributed, and people don't want to use them because they're sort of the centerpiece of their furniture. That's happened before. But it's all about determining what's culturally appropriate for the population. We can't just assume one stove will work here and then it's going to work in this entirely different culture. You really have to drill down to what's going to be accepted. So that's going to involve a piloting and some evaluations and so on.
What kind of education goes on as a process? Like when you bring in the stove, who is kind of showing how to use it? And
Well, UNHCR would often be doing this with its NGO partners, but what you'd often find is you would ask women to experiment with the different stoves, incorporate their feedback on which stoves are better and why, sit down with the community leaders, get their feedback on them, and talk to the other members of the family too, because they're going to have a say in what gets adopted, why and why not. And I could pass on some really interesting evaluations on fuel-efficient stoves and refugee settings if you'd like. I've got to go through this very quickly, but I just wanted to give a case study of an actual response. This one's fresh in my mind. I was on the Tunisian-Libyan border for about 2 months. Starting February 15th, there were riots in eastern Libya that evolved into an all-out armed struggle with the government forces. So since that time, there were a great many migrants. In Libya. And since that time, about 193,000 fled Libya into Egypt, into Tunisia, into other countries, mostly Tunisia though. And there were 81,000 Libyan refugees who fled into Tunisia, and they're still there. To look at it another way, you can see the flow of migrants at the top who came out of Libya. And what happened was the conflict started taking a toll on the Libyan economy. And so as agriculture collapsed, these first few days, these are Egyptians who fled. As construction collapsed, then you had Bangladeshis who started to leave. And then when the oil rigs stopped working, then the sub-Saharan Africans came out. And with them, it was a question of getting them back. They had a home to go back to, so it was a question of protecting and assisting them until you could evacuate them and get them home. And most of them had been robbed by the Libyan military as they were coming out. So they had no resources by the time they arrived in Tunisia and were especially vulnerable. And then down here, not at first, but eventually you started to see Eritreans, Iraqis, Palestinians, and Somalis come out of Libya as well. They don't have a home to go to, at least not safely. And so for them, this is a different situation. You have to protect and assist them until you find solutions for them, and they're still there. So if you think about this, you have 50,000 people pouring across the border into Tunisia, a country that's in a fragile state. They're experiencing their own democratic transition. Their economy is not going well because tourism is way down. And then you have migrants who had been working for years, being paid intermittently. Some may have gone months without being paid, but those who did flee with money had it stolen from them by the time they got into Tunisia. So when you think about it, the implications for Tunisia and for the migrants, you think about what kind of a situation this would be without humanitarian assistance. It would have been extremely unstable. Just in terms of who the responders were, this didn't really come out in the media as much as it should, but the Tunisians were the heroes. in this response. They were leading the way. In some cases, the government does very little. Here, the Tunisians, the first people on the scene were the civil society. The Tunisian Red Crescent. You had local NGOs, concerned individuals. They were on the scene first. Then the Tunisian military showed up and was providing security and helping with food distributions. You had all the key ministries of the Tunisian government involved. Did a fantastic job. International organizations came in to assist, and then so did the international NGOs. But really, the Tunisian government, Tunisian civil society, they did the best job I've ever seen of any response. Really quickly, and how the U.S. government responded. U.S. government deployed teams to Tunisia, to Egypt, Malta, and then eventually into Libya itself. They're still there. They carried out needs assessment and they determined where the funding should go, to which partners and for what sectors. In all, over 81 million in support for the humanitarian response in Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt was given to humanitarian providers. And then, of course, diplomatic support for the Tunisian government as they're evolving into what will one day be a full democracy. So these are three key questions I had about the response. I won't answer them right now because I know we're short on time. But are we more or less likely to see similar emergencies like this in the future? Are we adequately prepared to deal with mixed migration flows in the future? And how do we support the leadership roles of governments, when they take an active role in responding? And we could come back to these. So some people ask me how to get started in humanitarian assistance. Jamie, I promise this is my last slide. And there's different ways to go about it, as advocates, diplomats, policymakers, working for the international organizations and for the NGOs. If somebody was asking how they can get started with it, they can volunteer or work with NGOs that protect and assist conflict victims overseas. They can work with the organizations that have headquarters that do the same, but they have headquarters here in the United States. Like I said, the refugee resettlement program in the United States is the largest in the world, and there's lots of opportunities to work with the NGOs, the churches, the community groups that are helping to integrate the refugees, to learn English, to find a job, to access the healthcare system, and so on. And then the American Red Cross offers trainings on disaster response. Is humanitarian assistance required in the United States sometimes? Yeah, no country's immune. And then the other advice I would give is just being familiar with humanitarian principles and standards. And we talked a little bit about that. And knowing languages is very, very useful when you're getting started in this line of work. A few online resources, which will be in the PowerPoint. And just to wrap it up, the United States continues to demonstrate its leadership by providing strong financial support to the humanitarian organizations and through humanitarian diplomacy. That's a message for your students. There's a lot of suffering in the world, but there's a lot of people who are doing something about that. That includes civil society, that includes the government, and so on. We're trying to adapt to a variety of emerging challenges in order to effectively protect and assist vulnerable populations. And then just that there's no set path for becoming a humanitarian, but there's many opportunities, many different ways that anybody can get involved. And Jamie, that's it. That was a question and an observation and a question. And the issue is that in disasters and emergencies, some organizations receive a great deal of funding while other ones are overlooked. And the question is, are we doing anything to coordinate the donations that people give? We can make recommendations, and USAID, our sister agency, can make recommendations as well. And we do. But at the end of the day, people will give money to the organizations and the causes that resonate with them. But I think I would agree with you that it's very important to do your research. That instead of running up to the computer the day after and making an online donation, it's better to take some extra time and to determine what the needs are. You can use Charity Navigator and other websites to get a sense of an organization broadly, what they do, what their track record is, how much money actually goes to the field. But depending on the country, depending on what country you're in, the organizations that are the strongest are going to change, for example. So, I mean, but if you look at if you look at the earthquake response in Haiti, there were strong health organizations there, strong organizations working in water and so on, who were already there, and then there were quite a few that came in. I guess the answer to that question is no, we're not doing enough to coordinate the contributions that go into disasters and emergencies, but we try. Yes? Okay, so if you look at any humanitarian situation, for example, let's take Somalia. We can and we should provide humanitarian assistance in Somalia because the need is there. But at the same time, that will not address the underlying causes of instability in Somalia. Helping to reestablish a government that can provide basic services to its citizens and is accountable and transparent, that is what gets you out of that situation. And so we will continue to provide humanitarian assistance in Somalia, but at the same time, as slow as the process is, we are working to help reestablish a Somali government. So that's just one example. Or if you look in the case of Haiti, that gap between relief and development that we talked about, you can also think of it as a gap between programs and policies. And until Haiti has a framework for decentralization, for eminent domain, for determining who owns what piece of land, then they're not going to be able to find solutions for all the people who remain displaced from the 2010 earthquake. So supporting humanitarian assistance while working closely with the government to provide them technical expertise, to provide them, guidance and support in developing these policies that will help get them out of the situation. That's an example of the political element. So when we're talking about politics, it's often about engagement, constructive engagement. Yes, sir. The question is, in disasters in which corporations play a major role, how do you ensure access to the best quality information in an accountable way? My honest answer to that is I don't know. The State Department and USAID have a mandate for working overseas. The exception to that would have been Katrina, when we actually had to respond to a humanitarian situation in our own country. But it's a good question. It's a fair point. It's one that deserves more consideration. I think that would be an issue that would involve the Department of Commerce, certainly, Interior. It would involve a number of different, FEMA, certainly. It would involve a number of different agencies. But myself, I'm not sure. Sorry. And I've been neglecting this table back here. Okay, I think the question is, how does a lack of consensus and resolution on the role of climate change, let's say the impact of climate change, have on humanitarian work provided through the State Department and USAID? Well, in some ways our work is easier because we can incorporate mitigation. We could try to address climate change as part of an all hazards approach, being prepared for anything in settings where we're protecting and assisting these populations. So we don't have to wait for Congress to authorize us to try to get ready and to try to do more, to adapt and to mitigate. I find the challenge in the field, though, is often a lack of a knowledge base, lack of technical assistance for disaster mitigation generally, including those which will be made worse by climate change, particularly too much water or too little water. Some of our partners are very good at responding to emergencies, but less good at preventing them. And I think that mitigating the impact of emergencies, that's got to be a central responsibility of all of our partners going forward if we're going to be able to stand up to the challenges that we're facing now and that are going to face increasingly in the future. So I guess the short answer is we can and should be doing more in regards to adaptation and mitigation, and we're able to do that. We don't have to wait for congressional authorization. Yes? Okay, so I think the question is humanitarianism versus the question is the difference between humanitarianism and human rights from a practical perspective. For us, I mean, we're very concerned about international humanitarian law and all the, and all the internationally agreed upon documents and laws that are under that, and just enforcing and just promoting and enforcing international humanitarian law, is a huge undertaking. That's where we come at it. We come at it from a human rights approach. The right, everything from the right to health to, and so on. But I think humanitarianism means different things to different people. When I work with my colleagues from the Department of Defense, for example, we're often talking about humanitarian assistance, but we're meaning different things, really. We're talking about doing things for people that need them, but with different intentions. Like for them, a big part of their humanitarian assistance, as they call it, it's a bit of a misnomer, is winning hearts and minds so that you can have better access to an area, to a population, so that people will like you better and stop shooting at you, and so on. But for us, humanitarian assistance means identifying the most vulnerable populations, determining where the need is greatest, and how to assist those populations for its own sake. Like for us, that's humanitarian, is not because we want a population or a government to like us better, not because we're looking for opportunities in a particular region or so on, but because it's the right thing to do. So for us, in a broad sense, that's what we would think of from a humanitarian perspective. But in terms of producing concrete action, we fall back on international humanitarian law. It's a push and a pull, and it's a negotiation. You may find that whether a government has signed up on certain documents, one administration may respect that and the next may not, or their interpretations of it may differ, which will affect how you negotiate with them. The question is, how do you handle rescue at sea? What about the populations that did not go to a refugee camp or a transit camp but took off in boats? We'll never know how many people left by boat, precisely because some of them are going to die during that passage, unfortunately. Some people, in fact, this was a problem initially with the Somali refugee population. They came to the camp that had been set up in Tunisia, and some of them had been hoping for quick resettlement or to receive opportunities that were slow in coming, and decided that they'd rather vote with their feet, and they went back into Libya, if you can imagine that. Went back into Libya to find boats for Europe. And during the conflict, the cost of doing so went down significantly. We can debate why that is, but it did go down significantly. So in terms of rescue at sea, I mean, UNHCR and IOM, the UN Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration, have got to be front and center. But also we can't minimize the role of the host governments, and the governments that have responsibility for the bodies of water, around their countries. It's UNHCR, I mean, what it often is UNHCR and IOM taking on an advocacy role, reminding these governments of their responsibilities to protect the rights of vulnerable populations, even when they're on a boat. And once they land, to make sure to make sure that they're treated humanely, that their claims are examined to see if there are legitimate refugees on board, and to make sure that they're protected and assisted. So it is a major problem that you pointed out, and it's one that continues today, and it's one that the leadership at UNHCR and IOM, but often the missing piece is leadership from the receiving governments themselves.